event today. So I want to welcome and introduce the president of the Los Angeles Sports Council, Mr. David Simon.
Thanks, Pat.
Thank you. David is going to speak to us in part about Los Angeles's 2024 Olympic bid.
Thanks, Pat. And I assume you've all heard that the U.S. Olympic Committee, after initially selecting Boston earlier this year to be the candidate from the United States for 2024, shifted about a month ago to pick Los Angeles. So if you need background on that story, raise your hand. I assume you all know about that. What I wanted to do was tell you why I think the Olympics, the idea of hosting the Olympics, has been more warmly received in Los Angeles than it was in Boston. And to do that, I'm going to give you a quick history lesson because Los Angeles' history with the Olympics goes back a long way. Los Angeles has hosted the Olympics twice. Anybody know what the years were? Make this a little interactive. 32 and 84, correct.
Ooh.
And how about, what was the first American city to host the Olympics? Exactly. Okay. They don't know that in LA, by the way. But that's right. But the history of the 32 Olympics, which is where Los Angeles' Olympic history begins, actually starts in 1919, 96 years ago. And it was right after the First World War. Los Angeles was a much smaller place, population maybe a couple of 100,000. And at that time, the civic leaders of the day got together and they were trying to figure out how they could come up with an idea for an event that would increase tourism for Southern California. And they formed something called the Los Angeles Festival Committee. And they got together and decided, what can we do? The Rose Bowl, as we know it today, didn't exist yet. But someone at this meeting, while they were banding about ideas for Mexican fiestas and other things, said, what about the Olympic Games? And there was a man at the meeting named Bill Garland, who was a real estate investor locally. And he said, well, you know, they're going to be in Belgium next summer, 1920, and I already have a trip planned to Europe next summer. So how about if I go to the International Olympic Committee and ask them if they'd come to Los Angeles for the Olympics? Well, everybody at the meeting thought that was a fine idea, especially because Garland was going to be paying for his own trip. It was an expensive and time-consuming enterprise in those days. You couldn't fly, obviously. You had to take a train all the way across country. When you got to the East Coast, you had to shift to a boat. The boat took 5 or 6 days to get to Europe, and then another train, a couple of days to get to Switzerland, or in this case, Belgium, where the IOC was meeting. So he got there, was warmly received by the IOC, presented a letter from the mayor of the city of Los Angeles, and the IOC, first question, any idea what it was? Where is Los Angeles? And he had to go to a map and point to a place on the North American West Coast where Los Angeles was. And then somebody asked him, well, is that anywhere near Hollywood? They knew about Hollywood even then. Well, they told him that they couldn't give him the Olympics, you know, sight unseen like that, but they did want to know whether Los Angeles had a stadium that could accommodate the track and field and the opening ceremonies. He said, no, I'm sorry, we don't. And they said, well, if you can prove to us that you have a stadium, we will give you the Olympics. So with that, he sailed back home, and when he got back to Los Angeles, he became the civic leader that drove the building of what is today the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. It was completed 3 years later, and he went back to the IOC, wherever they were meeting in 1923, showed them photographs of the Coliseum, and they said, you have the Olympics in 1932. And that should have been just an automatic happy ending following that story, but it wasn't, because in the intervening years, the IOC wasn't accustomed to awarding the Olympics so far in advance. They usually did it 5 or 6 years in advance back then. So to have a 9-year gap meant that no one could have foreseen that in 1929 the stock market was going to crash and the 32 Olympics would be held in the middle of the Depression. So in the run-up to the 32 Olympics, there was much criticism. There was much talk about why should we be celebrating a sporting event when people are on bread lines and selling apples on street corners. There were also concerns that athletes wouldn't be able to come from around the world, be able to afford the trip. And in fact, that was largely true. There were many countries that had trouble. Brazil sent a team on a coffee boat from Rio, and they had to sell coffee along the way to finance their trip. And when they got to New Orleans, that was as far as they could go. They had to get off, and they only had enough money for a certain number of athletes to make the train trip to Los Angeles. And there were stories like that from all around the world. But ultimately, the 32 games were tremendously successful. They were considered the most successful ever held up until that time. And they made a profit in the middle of the Depression of $1 million, which was considered pretty extraordinary then, and I think even today. is eye-opening. Well, the curtain came down on the 32 Olympics. Now, a few years later, it's 1939. The 1940 Olympics were supposed to be in Tokyo, Japan. And along about 1939, the IOC realized, you know, maybe that wasn't the best choice. Maybe we've got a better option with war clouds gathering. So what they did was to look at who has hosted the games recently that could step in. Well, the 36 Olympics, the immediate prior games, had been in Berlin, and that was no better than Tokyo as far as the IOC was concerned. But 1932 in Los Angeles was another story. So they reached back out to Bill Garland, the man who made that trip to Belgium and got the Coliseum built, and had since been made an IOC member. And they said to him, can you gin up a quick proposal for Los Angeles to host the 1940 Olympics on 1 year's notice? And he said, sure, we'll do it. And they formed an organization just for that purpose called the Southern California Olympic Committee, which was dedicated to that proposal. Well, the 1940 Olympics were eventually canceled. They weren't held at all. But the organization that had been formed stayed in existence. And after World War II, the IOC started up business again, and they were awarding the 1948 Olympics, which eventually went to London. But Los Angeles decided to bid because they had this organization that had been formed for this 1940 proposal. Well, that organization, the Southern California Committee for the Olympic Games, still exists today and became the impetus for a Los Angeles tradition of bidding for the Olympics every 4 years, because Los Angeles kept bidding and losing. So from 1948 until 1984, when Los Angeles won the right to host the games, Los Angeles bid every single time and lost every single time. So we have the distinction in Los Angeles of being in the IOC record books for two things. One is we are one of only 5 cities to have been awarded the games more than once, along with Paris, London, Athens, and now Tokyo, which is going to host the games in 2020. So that's pretty good company. We also stand by ourselves, all alone, in having lost more Olympic bids than any city in the world. But there's a connection between those two things, because it was the unsuccessful bids that paved the way for the eventual successful bid, and it was LA's persistence that persuaded the IOC to eventually return. Now, when the '84 games were awarded, it was the late 1970s, different environment completely. And Los Angeles had been bidding for so long that it was generally acknowledged that they would be the favorite internationally. In fact, there was only one other country that expressed interest in bidding other than Los Angeles, and that was one other city, and that was Tehran. Now, they had some management problems in Tehran at the time, so that bid never materialized. But the IOC had no choice. There was only one candidate, and yet it wasn't automatic. Much like the case in 1932, which had problems for different reasons, 1984, the issue was local people in Los Angeles were polled, and they all said, you know what, we'd love to have the Olympics. It was 70–80% approval, the idea of having the Olympics. But the previous Olympics had been held in 1976, Montreal. The Montreal Olympics ran up a deficit of over $1 billion in 1976 dollars. And if you talk to someone in Montreal, they didn't finish paying off that debt until 2006. So the people of LA were naturally skittish about that. So they passed a ballot measure, which actually Boston would have been wise to do in retrospect. They passed a ballot measure before the games were officially awarded saying, we prohibit the city of Los Angeles from spending any tax dollars on running the Olympics if they come here. So the IOC had always asked cities bidding for the games up to that time, you have to sign a contract saying you will be responsible, your city, for any cost overruns for the games. Well, LA wasn't willing to do that. The IOC didn't like the idea of compromising, changing its rules, but it had no choice. So eventually a compromise was worked out. The games were awarded to the city of Los Angeles, but really to a private organizing committee for the first time. And that allowed the private organizing committee not only to run the games, but to come up with a new financial model for running the games. And under Peter Ueberroth, instead of government grants funding the operation of the games, it was ticket sales and corporate sponsorships and television revenues at an unprecedented level. The '84 games, like 1932, were considered the most successful of their era up until that time. Well, we no longer bid for the games in Los Angeles every 4 years. We haven't bid every time since 1984 because there were some intervening developments. Atlanta won the right to host the '96 games, and since '84, there have only been 3 opportunities to bid. for the Games put forward by the United States Olympic Committee, 2012, 2016, and now 24. Los Angeles bid for each of those. We were successful, obviously, just this last month for 2024. And I give you that brief overview of history just to give you an example of why I think the people of LA were more receptive to the idea of having the Olympics and are more enthusiastic in public polling than were the people of Boston, who did not have the experience of previous Olympics or even previous bids to go by and saw only the specter of financial losses and something coming out of their pocket. That's not the case in LA. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Pat, for any questions. Or
let's have a seat. And you know, David, I guess one question, I don't know if you can comment on this, but don't you think it's odd that the USOC didn't see that there wasn't the public support from Boston? Doesn't that seem odd that they would have gone that route when it became so clear afterward that there wasn't the level of support that Los Angeles has?
Yeah, well, yesterday, yes, I think that's true, but yesterday the USOC actually, the chairman of the USOC at an event in Colorado Springs where their headquarters are, admitted that the USOC had made a mistake in choosing Boston in retrospect. So I think they would acknowledge that as well today.
Tell us why Los Angeles. You've given us a historical perspective, but if we focus on today and the pragmatics of putting on an Olympic Games, why is LA in such a uniquely positioned place to put on those games?
Well, we're well suited. First of all, the weather's great in the summer, but we also have wonderful facilities that are mostly existing. We have about 85% of all the facilities that you need already. They're in place, they're there. The challenge is we have to make sure that the international community understands that when we say we have all these great existing facilities, with just a couple of exceptions, they're not the facilities that were there for the '84 Olympics. It's mostly facilities that have come online since that time.
Can anyone name what some of those facilities are that weren't there in '84 that are there now? Staples Center. So what would they, sports there would be? Yeah,
well, gymnastics would be most likely at Staples Center. I mean, you can move the pieces around the checkerboard a lot in terms of what goes in. You know, if you have arenas, any arena sport can go in that arena, stadium sports.
Other facilities? StubHub Center in Carson, which they have, of course, LA Galaxy. Chris Klein was here earlier today, so they can do soccer out there. Where else?
The other facilities are probably not quite as well known, but Galen Center is where USC basketball and volleyball are played. There's a facility in Long Beach called the Pyramid, which is where Long Beach State has its home games. So in Orange County, we have the Honda Center, where the Ducks play. So there are a number of facilities that have come online that are essentially brand new. And who knows, we may even have an NFL team back.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, if a facility is built, if a football stadium is built, do you think that that impacts the IOC's decision? Because from the renderings that we've seen, and my students have seen it in our class, the renderings are fantastic. Yeah, well, any new stadium will be great, will be an addition, and will be helpful, but will not be where track and field and the opening ceremonies take place. That will still be the Coliseum, which would have hundreds of millions of dollars poured into it as part of a successful Olympic bid, but we're not there yet. What are the one or two?
The real question is which is going to come first, another Olympics in LA or the NFL returning? Maybe a close call.
Good question for a panel or two from now. One or two biggest challenges of Los Angeles hosting the Olympics?
Well, if you're referring to the actual staging of the games, or do you mean the campaign that's coming up, the two-year campaign?
Let's take both.
Well, in the two-year campaign, Los Angeles is up against 4 other cities, all from European countries, Paris, Rome, Hamburg, and Budapest. They will all put forth a capable effort. Paris, if you pay attention to the media now, is the current early favorite because Paris had a strong bid for the 2012 games and lost out to London by only 2 votes. So the IOC likes it when you persist like that. And Los Angeles has not been an international candidate since the 1970s when we bid for the '84 games. So in a way, we're both a veteran and a newcomer when it comes to this campaign. And the IOC has no rules relative to geographic rotation of the games. They could have them in Europe every time if they so voted, but they don't. But as a practical matter, since the revival of the games in 1896, they've never stayed away from Europe for more than 3 times. And next year's games are in Rio, and the 2020 games have already been awarded to Tokyo. So many will say that informally at least, it is Europe's turn. And that will be a challenge for Los Angeles to deal with. On the other side of that equation, you can say that the way the IOC does its voting with multiple rounds of voting for the games, it's likely that it'll come down to a final round with a European city against Los Angeles, because Los Angeles will be able to play its geographic hand, and the European cities will figure to knock each other out of the running along the way. And so, depending on which city it is, and it's a roll of the dice at that point.
And what about the operational logistics, the 1 or 2 biggest challenges of once the games, or if the games come, making it work smoothly?
Well, we've done it before, and even though it's not in the memory of a lot of people who are alive today, if you are in Los Angeles, you know that LA is an Olympic city, and you have heard from if you were too young to have enjoyed the games yourself in 1984, you have heard from parents, family members, co-workers, the media, that it was a wonderful thing and a great success and memorable for everyone. So you have that going for you. On the other hand, you still have people who will raise the same issues that were raised before about traffic and air pollution and all the things, criminal activity and all the things that couldn't go wrong. And I can go right down the list and tell you why those are red herrings. I'll start with criminal activity. People say, gosh, everybody's going to descend on Los Angeles because so many of the world's rich people are going to come here for the games. And in fact, statistically, history shows the reverse. The pickpockets, or whether the small-time criminals or the large-time criminals, they want to stay away from a place where the Olympics are going on because every other person might be a security guard. You just don't know. So criminal activity migrates. Transportation is another example. When the games were held in Los Angeles in 1984, we did a number of things, literally 30 different things, to adjust to having the Olympics. And so for 2 weeks, the Teamsters agreed to have all their deliveries occur between midnight and 6 a.m., as one example. All the larger employers agreed to have their employees go on flex time, so instead of 9 to 5, it would be 7 to 3. And because of East Coast television time, most of our events were starting at 5 and 6 p.m., the evening events. So things like that and dozens of other steps, everyone was willing to get on board and do that for 2 weeks. You can get people to change their behavior for 2 weeks. You can't get them to do it permanently, unfortunately. But you can solve short-term problems like that by asking people to do things that are in their self-interest in the near term.
Any questions from the audience with respect to LA's bid for the Olympics? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about, should you win, what's involved in putting together the huge staff that has to come together to make that happen? Because it's not, it can't be simply volunteer run, and it's an enormous organization, I'm sure.
Yes. Well, I worked on the '84 games, and I was one of the first 5 employees hired by Peter Uberoth, who was the president of the organization. And over a 5-year period, I started work in 1979, and over a 5-year period, I say that I worked for a small company, a medium-sized business, and a large corporation without ever changing jobs, because we built from 5 employees to 1,100 full-time employees by about 6 months before the games. And then it ballooned up from there very quickly because we had between part-time employees who worked just for a few months and volunteers who worked for maybe just a few weeks. The number was around 50,000. So the numbers required to actually stage the games are huge. The numbers required for permanent full-time staff that work 6 months or more is much less, but it's still daunting. And so there's really no blueprint for saying we're going to have exactly this many people here and 6 months later exactly this many. Uberoth used to wait until everybody was at the breaking point before he would allow a department to add to its staff. I know he didn't have a master plan coming out of the gate, and we were pretty lean for what it was that we accomplished. But on the other hand, you're able to, you have a great talent pool to choose from people who feel this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
You know, David, one of the stories that have come out of the IOC is they basically want more fiscal responsibility. So when you talk about, and there's no way that I can be unbiased as it relates to this discussion, not only as an American, but also as a part-time resident of Los Angeles, can Paris provide the facilities that Los Angeles can? Can they put on the games as fiscally responsibly as Los Angeles could?
I'm not familiar with the details of Paris's bid, but I'm guessing that, like most European countries, if the French win, there will be some French government money available to the organizing committee for the operation of the games and or the construction of facilities. And I guess my response is each city and each country has to come up with a plan for the Olympics that suits them. But what you have to keep in mind is there's really two budgets, if you will, or two major tasks in staging an Olympics. One is the organization of the games, and the other is infrastructure projects related to the games. And the infrastructure projects can be, in many cases, regarded as optional for the actual staging of the games. Some cities will choose to renovate or build a new airport, for example, or they may renovate or build or add on to their subway system. Those arguably are not essential to the staging of the games, but cities choose to do them because the Olympics make it possible for them to do them, and the community needs them. So I think you have to separate those two things. Paris may have some needs there that we don't in Los Angeles, as one example. But the operation of the games fundamentally should be able to be covered by your ticket sales, your sponsorships, and your television, anywhere you do it in the world.
What is this rift, or that was a rift, between the USOC and the IOC as it related to revenue sharing? Can you educate folks on that? Because I don't know if everyone knows about what that was all about.
Well, this goes back a few years, and it's a problem that has been solved. But there was a time when the USOC and the IOC were on the outs, and it had to do with the way in which television money from the Olympics is shared worldwide. And there's a formula that the IOC has had for quite some time where each international federation, whether it's gymnastics or swimming or whatever it is, gets a small percentage of the TV money. The IOC gets the lion's share, and then other percentages flow in a certain way. The USOC was getting 18 to 20% of those funds from corporate sponsorships and I think from television as well. And the rationale was that so much of the funding from the sponsors was from American companies. But ultimately, that got some pushback from other players in the Olympic world who felt that they were getting shortchanged at the US's expense. So eventually, the USOC agreed to change the formula somewhat over the next dozen years, and that satisfied everyone. And while that was going on, however, the US elected not to bid for the games that went to Tokyo in 2020 because the argument was considered to be so tense.
One last question I have before we take a short break. Rio, water pollution, your thoughts?
I've been reading the same reports everyone else has, and I have decided not to compete in sailing in Rio next year. No, but I mean, I say that facetiously. I sincerely hope.
It seems like a major mistake on the IOC's part.
Well, what needs to happen is they need to come up with something that is going to assure the athletes and the media that no athlete is going to be at risk for competing. Right now, that seems not to be the case.
I don't know how they get around it, except perhaps use Southern California for the aquatics events.
Well, no, I understand they could move to a different bay in Rio, and they would not have the problem they do at the current one. So I think there are solutions, and it will probably be driven by the Federation for Sailing. We'll see.
He's the president of the Los Angeles.
Yeah, thanks.
Welcome our fifth panel.